The golden age of Hollywood always smelled of expensive perfume and glittered with diamonds. But if you stepped closer, beneath the polish crept the heavy stench of stale breath and cheap whiskey. We're used to seeing them as gods on the screen, but today we're peering into their real lives, into a world where fame became a sentence, and the bottom of a glass was the only place to hide from the glare of the spotlights. This is a chronicle of 10 great downfalls, proof that the Dream Factory was built not only on fantasies, but on the shattered lives of its brightest stars. But before we begin with our first name, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show. John Barrymore. Let's start with royalty, my dear lovers of other people's dirty laundry. If you think the Barrymore family tree begins and ends with Drew and her sweet rom-com smile, you're sorely mistaken. The patriarch of this dynasty, John Barrymore, also known as the Great Profile, was a Hollywood god worshipped by theater lovers across the world. His Hamlet was considered definitive, and his face a divine gift studios were willing to pay any price for. But as the saying goes, if genius runs thick in your bloodline, your bottle has to be just as large as your talent. John started hitting the bottle at 14. While his peers were playing baseball, this young aristocrat was already tasting gin as if it were holy water. By the time he became a global superstar, his liver wasn't just sending warning signs, it had raised the white flag and was begging for mercy. Barrymore didn't simply drink, he destroyed himself with aristocratic flair. He believed alcohol fueled his genius, when in reality it was a poison that methodically turned his razor-sharp mind into sludge. By the 1930s, this lord of the stage had become a walking disaster, reeking of cheap whiskey from a mile away. Picture the scale of the catastrophe. Millions watching him, hailing him as an icon, and he couldn't string together 2 words without stumbling. On the set of Counselor at Law in 1933, a humiliation occurred that went down in Hollywood infamy. John Barrymore, the greatest tragedian of his time, needed 25 takes to get through one short scene. He stood before the camera, sweating, flushing, and still mangled the lines like a confused first grader. His brain, effectively pickled in ethanol, simply refused to absorb new words. Directors tore their hair out while producers calculated the losses from every stalled minute. In the end, Hollywood, that cynical vulture which forgives nothing, did what it does best. It stopped selling Barrymore's talent and started selling his public collapse. John became a one-man zoo. He was cast not because he was good, but so audiences could gape at how a once magnificent lion had turned into a mangy barroom dog. He wound up playing a humiliating parody of himself for pocket change, a bloated, washed-up drunk forever hunting for a morning cure. In films like Playmates from 1941, audiences weren't laughing at the character's wit, but at the grotesque spectacle John himself had become. Studios dragged him around like a carnival freak, forcing him to perform alcoholic dementia for public amusement. He accepted every degradation, every bottom-tier role in third-rate comedies, as long as the paycheck covered the next bottle, the one that helped him forget who he used to be. His end was as filthy and degrading as the beginning of his career had been brilliant and pristine. Barrymore died at 60 from cirrhosis of the liver and kidney failure, his body literally falling apart on a hospital bed, drowning in its own bile. And even death denied the Great Profile the dignity and peace he had feared so much in life. There's a legend that reeks of decay, formaldehyde, and booze. They say his close friend, the notorious reveler Errol Flynn, along with a pack of drinking buddies, stole John's body straight from the morgue after bribing a drunk night watchman. Why? To throw the greatest and most grotesque drinking party in Hollywood history.
They hauled Barrymore's cold corpse into a mansion, seated him in his favorite leather chair, slipped a glass of whiskey into his stiffened fingers, and drank with the dead man until dawn, raising toasts to the departed genius. What a noble finale, wouldn't you say? From national idol and standard of male beauty to a silent prop at one last drunken orgy. John Barrymore didn't just drink himself to death, he turned his life and his death into a cheap farce, leaving behind nothing but the stink of booze and the bitter aftertaste of lost greatness.
Barbara Payton. If you think modern starlets like Lindsay Lohan or Britney Spears at her worst knew how to self-destruct, then you clearly never heard of Barbara Payton. This woman was not merely an actress, she became the living embodiment of the phrase hot mess long before the term ever existed. Her career was like a rocket launched by drunken mechanics, a blinding takeoff, showers of wild sparks, and a deafening crash straight into the deepest, foulest ditch Hollywood had to offer. Barbara was a dazzling blonde with the face of an angel and the appetites of a dock worker. Her rise was meteoric. After the 1950 film Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, where she starred alongside James Cagney himself, critics and studios alike were already crowning her the new Marilyn Monroe. Warner Bros. Paid her a staggering $5,000 a week, obscene money for the time. For a 22-year-old girl, it was a fortune she had no intention of spending on scripts or self-improvement. Instead, she poured it into endless rivers of alcohol and men, enthusiastically mixing those ingredients in the most explosive proportions imaginable. In 1951, Payton staged a spectacle that shocked even a Hollywood long accustomed to excess. She managed to juggle affairs with two famous actors at once, her official fiancé, Franchot Tone, and her lover, Tom Neal. Neal was a former boxer, a man with sledgehammer fists and absolutely no bricks. The inevitable showdown took place in Barbara's apartment when the two jealous rivals finally collided head-on. Neal unleashed a beating so brutal that little was left of the refined and intellectual Tone. Tone slipped into an 18-hour coma, his face reduced to a bloody ruin, and in that single night the careers of both men were effectively destroyed. Barbara, however, found the chaos amusing. She kept drinking as if a fire were burning inside her, a blaze that could only be doused with pure alcohol. After the so-called bloody triangle, the studios quickly realized that Payton was an expensive, unpredictable, and toxic liability. Contracts were torn up. She dragged what remained of her fame through the cheapest bars, trading diamonds for cheap vodka and luxurious mansions for filthy motels. By 1962, nothing remained of her former beauty. Barbara Payton, once adored by millions, now weighed close to 100 kilos. Her face had turned swollen and purple, her skin slack and ruined by relentless drinking. She reeked of stale booze and cheap cigarettes long before she came into view. She became a regular fixture in dives along Sunset Boulevard, where she played at being a starlet, begging strangers for a drink. When the money finally ran out completely, she sank to the lowest point of all and turned to prostitution. The former Hollywood star was arrested for vagrancy and indecent behavior, and in court she stared at the judges with cloudy eyes, barely understanding where she was. Her ending was pure horror. She died at 39 on a couch in the couch of her parents' home, the same parents who had tried and failed to pull her out of the abyss. The autopsy revealed total heart and liver failure. Her organs had simply burned out in an alcoholic inferno. Barbara Payton stands as a brutal example of how quickly Hollywood chews up a beautiful body and spits it onto the sidewalk when there is nothing inside but a craving for the next drink. She wanted to become a legend and instead turned into a cautionary tale, the story of how a golden girl became a drunken shadow, one that everyone preferred to forget.
Buster Keaton. If you thought Buster Keaton's stone face was merely a clever acting mask, you were wrong. By the middle of his career, it had become a mask of frozen terror and alcoholic numbness. The great comedian who, alongside Chaplin, helped lay the very foundation of Hollywood, had every reason to hate the world around him. His downfall began in 1928 when he made what he later called the worst mistake of his life, signing a contract with a ruthless monster known as MGM. The studio bosses were quick to explain to the genius that his creative freedom now belonged to them. Louis B. Mayer didn't see a great artist in Keaton, only a trained monkey. He was reduced to a cog in the assembly line, forbidden to design his own stunts, stripped of editing control, and forced to act in crude, joyless garbage. Buster, whose mind was built to invent intricate mechanisms and acrobatic miracles, couldn't survive this mutilation of his talent. He did what so many broken people of that era did. He dove headfirst into the bottle, hoping its bottom was closer than reality. By 1932, his alcoholism was no longer a private matter. Keaton had turned into an unpredictable, foul-smelling wreck. He dragged his booze-soaked breath straight into the frame, staggering onto set so drunk he couldn't stand without assistants holding him upright. His legendary composure gave way to the dull, glassy stare of an alcoholic who no longer knew what year it was or why everyone around him was in such a hurry. He could forget that filming was even happening and simply wander off the set in search of another drink. MGM's patience snapped in 1933. After yet another epic binge in his work trailer escalated into a violent rampage that left studio property damaged, Keaton was thrown out like a diseased dog. Yesterday's millionaire and owner of a lavish Italian villa became a nobody overnight. His wife, unwilling to endure the antics of a drunken husband, filed for divorce, took the children, and stripped him of everything he had. Buster hit absolute bottom, a state psychiatric hospital, bound in a straitjacket. Yet even in the grip of delirium tremens and brutal withdrawal, he remained master of physical skill. Using techniques he'd learned in childhood from Harry Houdini himself, Keaton managed to pick the impossible lock of the straitjacket and escape the institution, leaving the orderlies to find nothing but an empty room. Freedom, however, did not bring a triumphant return. The career of the greatest comedian of his era had been reduced to zero. Hollywood is a city with a very short memory. For years he survived on humiliating bit parts, a nobody in the background, and for pennies wrote jokes for rising stars like the Marx Brothers, who often had no idea their gags came from a silent film legend. He lived in cheap, smoke-filled boarding rooms, drinking away his last cents and staring at his old posters with bleary, watering eyes. Though he was rediscovered late in life in the 1950s, hailed once more as a forgotten genius, and even awarded an honorary Oscar, the Golden Age remembered him forever as a symbol of how the studio machine grinds unique talents into dust, turning them into drunken ghosts of the past. Buster Keaton never smiled on screen, but in life he wept bloody tears, searching at the bottom of a glass for the freedom and recognition Hollywood had so cynically stolen from him. His stone face became a tombstone over his own buried career.
Gail Russell. If Barbara Payton's story is one of debauchery, then the fate of Gail Russell is pure, distilled terror of fame. Imagine a girl so flawless she was called the Hedy Lamarr of Santa Monica. She had the face of a porcelain doll, bottomless eyes filled with sorrow, and a contract with the Paramount giant that thousands could only dream of. Yet behind that divine beauty hid a broken child, crippled by a pathological, paralyzing shyness that bordered on madness. Gail Russell was the quintessential accidental star, cynically plucked from ordinary life by Hollywood and forced to shine under the spotlights without anyone asking whether she had the strength to endure it. She was terrified of people and open spaces. At times it became absurd. When agents came to her home with lucrative offers, the future screen icon would crawl under the piano or wedge herself into a closet, shaking with fear and begging to be left alone. To get this trembling shadow onto the set of The Uninvited in 1944, a well-meaning makeup artist, watching her teeth chatter in sheer terror, suggested a remedy: a couple of sips of whiskey for courage. That friendly advice became Gail's death sentence. Alcohol turned out to be the only key capable of briefly unlocking the steel doors of her inner hell. She began drinking on set, first small swallows from a tiny flask, hiding behind scenery, then full glasses just to be able to open her mouth and deliver a line without passing out from panic. She didn't drink for pleasure. She didn't love parties. She simply treated herself, methodically, with vodka, trying to numb a fear that froze her before the camera. By 1950, this treatment had reduced her life to rubble. Gail's reputation was so badly damaged that Paramount, looking at her perpetually swollen face, the blurred contours of her once perfect features, and her trembling hands no makeup could disguise, chose not to renew her contract. Yesterday's muse had become a liability. She dragged her depression through courtrooms and police stations, turning into easy prey for the tabloids. In 1957 came an episode both epic and pathetic. Blind drunk, Russell plowed her car at full speed straight into the front window of a cafe, narrowly missing a janitor. Photographers caught her in that moment, disheveled, half-dressed, and with cloudy, glassy eyes that revealed a single desire, that the shattered storefront might become her grave right then and there. The world saw what the Hedy Lamarr of Santa Monica had become, a ruined, lost woman who no longer knew how to exist without the crosshairs of a lens and a bottle of alcohol. She became an outcast in the city that had created her. Colleagues pretended not to recognize her, and social friends vanished instantly. Gail shut herself inside her tiny apartment, drew the curtains, and turned the place into a crypt. She drank vodka by the liter, barely eating, slowly and deliberately killing the last traces of the unearthly beauty audiences had once adored. The end was inevitable, frighteningly quiet and unmistakably noir. In 1961, Gail Russell was found dead in her neglected apartment. She was only 36. She lay on the floor amid piles of empty bottles, cigarette butts, and unfinished letters, while scripts she would never read again gathered dust on the table. The most horrifying detail was that no one noticed her absence for days. A woman whose face had once covered billboards across the country died in absolute ringing solitude, remembered by Hollywood only as the beautiful girl who never managed to step out from her hiding place beneath the piano. Errol Flynn. If anyone in Hollywood embodied the motto, "Live fast, die young, and leave a beautiful corpse," it was Errol Flynn. What Hollywood failed to mention was one small detail. In his case, die young meant looking 50 while resembling a 100-year-old man who had spent half a century pickled in pure alcohol and cocaine. Flynn was the very image of raw masculine force. His Robin Hood and Captain Blood made women's hearts melt and drove men mad with envy at his brazen animal confidence. But behind the facade of the untamed macho lurked something far more ordinary and hopeless. A chronic alcoholic who couldn't survive even an hour without chemical fuel. Errol didn't just drink, he raced death for time. He carried a flask of vodka onto set every single day. To outsmart vigilant producers, he soaked orange slices in alcohol or ordered watermelons infused with gin. Between takes, moments after dazzling sword fights, Flynn devoured these fruits, slowly turning his brain to mush. His legendary screen charisma was powered by rivers of liquor, and by 40, nature began presenting bills he could no longer pay. By the early 1950s, this screen athlete was visibly decaying before the public's eyes. His once granite-carved face sagged into something resembling stale dough. His skin took on a yellowish hue, a clear sign his liver was failing. Heavy bags settled under his eyes, and his gaze grew cloudy, unfocused, empty. In his provocatively titled autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, he admitted without shame or remorse that he abused anything he could get his hands on. The major studios that once indulged every excess now avoided him like a contagious disease. No insurer wanted to touch an actor who might collapse from a heart attack at any moment or vanish into a binge so deep no doctor could pull him back.
His roles grew smaller, the scripts cheaper, and Flynn himself became a walking joke, a former star invited onto talk shows merely to see whether he could reach the chair without falling. One of the most sordid chapters came near the end. Flynn sank so low, financially and morally, that he began hawking dubious products and appearing in films that barely qualified as cinema, resembling cheap, tasteless exploitation fare like Cuban rebel burls. He effectively lived aboard his yacht, the Sirocco, once a symbol of luxury, now a floating den strewn with empty bottles, dirty laundry, and questionable companions. When he died suddenly at 50 in Vancouver, in the company of his 17-year-old lover, which felt grimly symbolic, the doctors performing the autopsy were stunned. On the table lay not the body of a 50-year-old man, but that of someone far older, worn down beyond recognition. His organs were ravaged, his heart exhausted by decades of relentless drinking and drugs. Errol Flynn wanted to remain forever the young pirate of the silver screen, but he died as a hollow, forgotten wreck. He was the face of the Golden Age and became its most brutal warning. For every year of reckless living, Hollywood exacts a tax of 10 years spent rotting from the inside out.
Veronica Lake. If Gail Russell was afraid of the camera, Veronica Lake seemed to genuinely hate the world itself, and Hollywood most of all. She became famous for her legendary peekaboo hairstyle, a cascade of dazzling platinum hair falling over one eye. The look created an aura of mystery, danger, and unattainable allure, as if she smelled of expensive perfume and trouble. But behind that glamorous facade lurked a personality her colleagues described bluntly as top-tier viciousness mixed with a pathological urge for self-destruction through the bottle. Her downfall was as fast and merciless as her rise. By the late 1940s, Veronica was drinking so heavily and so recklessly that studios began tearing up her contracts in horror. She became completely unmanageable. She insulted directors, deliberately sabotaged shoots, and showed up on set in such a state that her famous hairstyle served only to hide a bloodshot, drunken eye and a swollen lid. Colleagues like Frederick March openly told the press that working with Lake was like trying to perform a duet with a running chainsaw. She dragged her arrogance and stench of alcohol from studio to studio until the last doors finally slammed shut in her face. By 1951, Veronica's life had turned into a true noir thriller, only without a stylish ending. She and her husband, director André de Toth, officially declared bankruptcy. Their luxurious mansion, art collection, and all their possessions were seized for unpaid taxes. Yesterday's queen of noir, whose style and mannerisms had been copied by millions of women around the world, simply vanished. Hollywood, with its famously short memory, crossed her off the list of the living, and the press forgot her for an entire decade, as if she had never existed at all. The chilling truth surfaced only in 1962. A tabloid reporter stumbled upon Veronica Lake in New York. But this was no socialite wrapped in furs. It was an exhausted, prematurely aged woman working as a waitress in the bar of the cheap, bug-infested Martha Washington Hotel in Manhattan. She lived under an assumed name in a tiny, cluttered room in a flophouse and served drinks for pennies to people as broken as she had become. When she was recognized and photographers tried to capture her, she lifted her chin proudly and said that she simply liked talking to real people. But everyone could see the truth. Her hands shook with a fine tremor as she carried the tray, and her eyes held nothing but a thick alcoholic haze and a deep, simmering hatred for the world. Lake made a desperate attempt at a comeback, appearing in the low-budget, outright trash horror film Flesh Feast in 1970. The sight was genuinely painful. The once blinding beauty looked like a worn-out old woman, her gaze empty and burned hollow.
Alcohol didn't just ruin her career, it consumed her from the inside, methodically erasing every trace of the magic she once possessed. She died at 50 in a Vermont hospital from hepatitis and acute kidney failure, a classic dirty ending for someone who had spent decades drowning bitterness and unrealized rage in cheap gin. Veronica Lake was once a style icon, and she ended her life wiping sticky tables, collecting grimy tips, and cursing the system that first turned her into a glittering doll and then tossed her in the trash the moment the doll began to reek of booze and ruined takes. These were her final and most honest games of hide-and-seek with fate, and this time she lost for good.
William Holden. If you're looking for the darkest, most disturbing, truly noir ending in this list, congratulations, you've found it. William Holden wasn't just a star, he was Hollywood's golden boy, the standard of masculine grace, and an Academy Award winner. Audiences adored him for Sunset Boulevard and Stalag 17. He had everything one could dream of, a flawless face, an athletic build, millions in the bank, and the love of the most beautiful women in the world, including the legendary Audrey Hepburn. But behind that radiant Hollywood smile lived an alcoholic with such a long and brutal history that by the end of his life, it seemed his veins carried nothing but pure ethanol. Holden wasn't the kind of drunk who staged loud barroom scandals for the paparazzi. He was a quiet drinker, the most dangerous and incurable kind. His addiction was a slow poison that burned away everything human inside him over decades. First, it destroyed his long marriage. Then it drove Audrey Hepburn, who truly loved him, to flee without looking back. Living with a man whose true loyalty was to the bottle was unbearable. Gentle in the morning, he could turn into a bitter, distant stranger by night. By the 1970s, the Golden Boy had transformed into a corrosive, deeply lonely old man, dragging the shadow of past greatness behind him while feeling utterly hollow inside. The tragedy that shocked the world and made Hollywood fall silent occurred in November 1981. This was not a graceful, cinematic death surrounded by loved ones. It was an ending worthy of the bleakest low-budget noir. Heavily intoxicated in his luxury apartment in Santa Monica, Holden simply lost his balance. He slipped, fell, and struck his head against the edge of a bedside table. The injury was severe, but not immediately fatal. Investigators later concluded that Holden remained conscious for some time after the fall. Any sober person would have called for help, reached for a phone, or tried to stop the bleeding. But Holden's mind, numbed by an extreme level of alcohol, never sent the signal to save himself. Disoriented and trapped in a drunken haze, the Oscar-winning legend stayed where he was. Alone in the darkness of his expensive apartment, his life quietly ebbed away. His body was discovered only days later. Concern arose not because of his absence — Hollywood was used to the eccentricities of its stars — but because of a disturbing odor seeping from behind the heavy wooden doors. When police entered the apartment, they found a scene that stayed with them for years. An idol to millions, a symbol of strength and dignity, lying lifeless and forgotten. Fame, wealth, global recognition, none of it reached out to help him. He died the way the most abandoned people die, alone and unnoticed, with the only difference being that his solitude was wrapped in luxury. It was the cruelest lesson the Dream Factory ever taught. You can be a god on screen, but if your only faithful companion is a glass of whiskey, your ending will be empty, silent, and merciless. W.C. Fields. If anyone in the history of world cinema managed to turn alcoholism into a personal trademark, transforming vice into a profitable brand, it was W.C. Fields. With his eternally red, potato-shaped nose and unmistakable gravelly voice, he elevated drunkenness to the rank of high art. On screen, his perpetually tipsy characters provoked roaring laughter. Behind the scenes, that same comedy curdled into a never-ending domestic horror and a quiet reign of terror for everyone around him. Fields was a comedic genius, but the only true and sincere passion of his life was not the stage, not cinema, and certainly not people. It was gin. Fields went down in history as the man who proudly and publicly declared, "I never drink water because fish make love in it and pipes rust." This was not just a clever line polished for interviews. He genuinely despised any liquid that didn't carry at least 40% alcohol. His entire life became a grand, paranoid quest to hide booze from his enemies, wives, producers, and doctors alike. Even though all of Hollywood knew that Fields started drinking first thing in the morning, he still dragged around an arsenal of ingenious hiding places. Colleagues told stories that bordered on madness. Fields hid bottles of gin everywhere. Step into his mansion, and you might find alcohol in thermoses, behind fake book spines in the library, inside garden hoses, tucked into toolboxes, and even in medicine cabinets where gin had been carefully poured into cough syrup bottles. They said he could find a drink in an empty field simply because he had buried a stash there in advance, just in case the world ended. A workday for the king of comedy did not begin with oatmeal, but with a double martini the size of a respectable aquarium. On set, he always carried an enormous thermos he affectionately called his pineapple lemonade. Once, when someone on the crew decided to play a joke on the master and replaced its contents with actual God-forsaken lemonade, Fields delivered a reaction that became legend. Taking a sip and nearly choking with disgust, he bellowed across the soundstage, "Which bastard put water in my lemonade?" By the early 1940s, alcohol stopped being his fuel and became his personal executioner. His face was webbed with burst capillaries, his skin turned a sickly purplish red, and his fingers shook so badly he barely held his famous cane. Fields suffered from severe cirrhosis of the liver and dropsy, yet even when doctors begged him to stop drinking just to buy himself an extra week of life, he remained loyal to himself. He cynically bribed orderlies and nurses to smuggle his medicine straight into intensive care. He hid small bottles under his pillow and drank from them the moment the doctor's door clicked shut. The ending of this story is soaked in a shade of black humor no screenwriter could have invented. W.C. Fields spent his life loudly and demonstratively hating two things: children and Christmas. Fate, or death with a very particular sense of humor, decided that the great drunk would die on Christmas Day, 1946. He passed away in a hospital ravaged by pneumonia, cirrhosis, and his own bile, clutching a glass to his final breath, a glass that contained not a single drop of water. He managed to turn his illness into gold, but in the end, that golden joke devoured him completely, leaving the world with nothing but the image of an old cynic who never dared to find out what life tastes like without an alcoholic haze.
Robert Walker. If you think people in Hollywood only die of old age or in the golden glow of eternal fame, Robert Walker's story will shatter that illusion fast. Walker began as the perfect, wholesome boy next door. A gentle face, a shy smile, the image of a devoted young husband and father. But his life spiraled into a noir nightmare steeped in cheap liquor, breakdowns, and locked psychiatric wards. Because Hollywood is a place where your wife can be taken from you in broad daylight, and you're expected to applaud from the front row. His collapse began with a devastating blow. His wife, actress Jennifer Jones, left him for the all-powerful and ruthless producer David Selznick. Walker didn't merely suffer heartbreak, he came undone completely. Their smiling faces stared out from every tabloid cover. Their names echoed through every bar where he tried to forget. To numb the humiliation and pain, Robert turned to alcohol in destructive quantities until his mind began to fracture under the strain. He carried not just a flask of whiskey, but a crushing black depression, transforming rapidly from a soft-spoken young man into an aggressive, volatile alcoholic with a haunted stare. His drunken episodes became the stuff of legend. He was repeatedly arrested for driving under the influence, for violent altercations with police, for wandering the streets at night in a dazed state, shouting his ex-wife's name and cursing Selznick. Eventually, his nervous system gave out entirely, and Walker was committed for a year to the Menninger Clinic, a closed psychiatric institution, in a desperate attempt to piece together what remained of his shattered psyche. The cruel irony is that this total inner collapse led to the greatest and most terrifying role of his career, the charming, refined psychopath Bruno in Alfred Hitchcock's masterpiece, Strangers on a Train, 1951. He didn't have to act madness. It lived in every gesture, every twitch of his face, fed by years of alcohol and sedatives. Hitchcock was thrilled with the performance, unaware he was filming a man already standing on the edge of the grave. The triumph was explosive and brief. Shortly after production ended in August 1951, Walker suffered another severe emotional breakdown. He was heavily intoxicated, uncontrollable, shouting that he would end his life. A psychiatrist was called. Instead of allowing him to sober up under supervision, the doctor attempted to calm the star with a powerful sedative, sodium amytal, administered in an excessive dose. It was a fatal mistake. Walker's system was already saturated with alcohol, and the combination proved deadly. His heart, weakened by stress and long-term drinking, simply stopped. Robert Walker died at 32, at the very peak of his career revival, never fully experiencing the success of his defining role. Hitchcock was forced to complete the film using stand-ins, rear shots, and previously filmed material. Walker remains one of Hollywood's most tragic figures, a man who couldn't survive another's love or his own fragility, who fell from innocent romantic lead to a broken soul extinguished far too soon. His story stands as a grim reminder that in Hollywood, the most dangerous roles are sometimes the ones life itself assigns.
Montgomery Clift. If you thought the previous stories were bleak, prepare yourself for a finale that breathes grave, cold air. The story of Montgomery Clift is not merely another tale of alcoholism. It is a soul-freezing chronicle of a living man decomposing for a decade under the glare of the spotlights. Clift was an icon of the new generation, an intellectual with the face of a Greek god and eyes that seemed to hold all the pain and tenderness in the world. He was placed alongside Marlon Brando and destined to become the greatest actor of the century. But fate and the bottle had far more vicious plans for him. Everything changed on one cursed night in 1956, a night that split Hollywood history into before and after. Clift was driving home from a party at the house of his closest friend, Elizabeth Taylor. He was already heavily intoxicated, his reactions dulled by alcohol, and at full speed he slammed his car into a concrete telephone pole. Elizabeth, hearing the crash, was the first to reach the scene. What she saw was horrific. Monty's face had been turned into a bloody ruin. Taylor used her bare hands to pull shattered teeth from his throat so he wouldn't choke on his own blood right there, tangled in the wreckage of the steering wheel. Plastic surgeons worked miracles, piecing his face back together fragment by fragment, but the radiant, flawless young man was left forever on that dark stretch of road. Another person returned to the screen, a man with a frozen, distorted, almost paralyzed face and eyes inhabited by a primitive, unbearable terror. Clift could not accept what he saw in the mirror. To silence the physical agony of countless surgeries and the psychological hell of lost beauty, he embraced a lethal cocktail. Fistfuls of powerful painkillers, tranquilizers, and unimaginable, extreme amounts of alcohol. His post-accident life was officially and rightly labeled the longest suicide in Hollywood history. This was no exaggeration. Montgomery dragged his broken, perpetually drunk body from set to set, turning his colleagues' workdays into a nightmare. He didn't simply drink, he destroyed himself publicly and methodically. His behavior became completely unpredictable. He suffered paranoid episodes, could sit for hours in a catatonic trance staring into nothing, or suddenly explode into violent rage, smashing everything around him. Directors feared him, yet kept filming. His suffering on screen was so raw and authentic that audiences watched in stunned silence. In his last truly significant film, The Misfits, in 1961, he starred opposite Marilyn Monroe. The sight was heartbreaking. Two of the brightest and most shattered stars of the era sharing the same frame. Marilyn, herself teetering on the edge of madness, said of him words that became an epitaph. "He's the only person whose condition is worse than mine." Imagine the abyss Clift inhabited, if even Monroe admitted that. Montgomery no longer needed to act inner turmoil. He was that turmoil. His skin turned an ashen gray, his hands trembled constantly, and his gaze drifted somewhere beyond the limits of human comprehension. The end came in 1966, and it was intensely, terrifyingly quiet. Clift was found dead in his bed. He was only 45. Heart attack, the official report stated, but everyone in Hollywood knew the truth. His heart simply refused to continue that decade-long marathon through a marinade of vodka and psychotropic pills. On the evening before his death, his loyal assistant asked whether he wanted to watch one of his old films, The Young Lions, on television. Clift replied, "Absolutely not." Those were his final words. He did not want to see the beautiful young man he once was, the man he had so carefully, sip by sip, murdered over 10 long years. Montgomery Clift became the final nail in the coffin of the Golden Age. He proved that you can possess genius, global fame, and the loyalty of devoted friends, but if you decide that the bottom of a glass is your only refuge, Hollywood will watch your agony with cold curiosity until the final credits roll, and then simply turn off the lights.
The story of the Golden Age is not just a catalog of great films, but an endless obituary of those who couldn't withstand the glare of their own fame. We've seen how dazzling screen gods faded into shadows of themselves, ending their lives in empty apartments, cheap hotels, or pools of their own blood. Hollywood of that era was a merciless machine, draining every last drop of talent from a person, and then coldly replacing the defective part with someone younger, fresher, and sober. A bottle of whiskey became their only honest companion, one that didn't ask for autographs, but always demanded the highest price in return: life itself. These 10 fates will forever remain a reminder that behind every flawless frame of a cinematic fairy tale stood a very real, often unbearable pain, one no makeup could ever conceal.